I just unmuted. You're ready to go.
Well, good morning, everyone. We'll call the ASD School Board Governance Committee meeting to order. Today is Thursday, June 6th at 11:02 a.m. And your Chair, Carl Jacobs, will go around the room and do introductions. Starting to my right, Member Higgins.
Pat Higgins, board member.
Dave Donnelly, board member. Andy Ratliff, chief financial officer. Andrew Holloman, board member.
I'm Michael Moore, presenting the complaint only.
Katie Grant, executive assistant.
Mike Fleckenstein, Chief Information Officer. Sven Gustafson, Chief Academic Officer.
Sure. Bryant, Superintendent.
Row behind us.
Eric Fisty, Senior Director for Elementary Ed.
Jill Zwedney, Middle School Education.
Corey Yates, Teacher.
Jenny Knudsen, Mental Health Student Support.
Sarah Dykstra, mental health student support.
And Eric Backman, Senior Director of High School.
Welcome all. Let's get have a full room. Right, we called ourselves to order. We've done introductions. First item B1, policy review. This is a new iteration of the committee. So
Carl, this is Dora. I just wanted to let you know I'm online.
Oh, I'm
Great.
sorry. Yep,
Apologies,
Dora
Ms.
is online.
Fran. Is there anyone else online we need to acknowledge?
Marty Lang is online.
Great. All right. Now that we have introductions done and welcome Member Wilson, we'll start with our agenda B1 policy review. Again, this is a new iteration of this committee. For those who may have forgotten or are unfamiliar, we'll have a standing agenda item to re-review on a 3-year cycle on a section of board policy. In this iteration, we're reviewing 2000 through 21-23. Do any committee members wish to discuss one of these policies for review, which may need modification? If not, we will move on and note that these policies were reviewed according to our triennial cycle. Hearing, seeing none, we'll move on to B2, complaint and audit presentation. Dr. Brand, any introduction before we move on to the presentation?
Sure. So this presentation is in response to some board members' interests in refining our processes for how the district reviews complaints. So today we have our special guest, Mr. Michael Moore, who conducted that process review, and we look forward to hearing the board's input. And I believe we have a follow-up meeting after this to go deeper.
Welcome, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you for having me. Let me just do a brief introduction. So my name is Michael Moore. I was a practitioner for 30 years. Most of that time as a high school principal, superintendent of schools. For 20 years, I've been doing this kind of work. So 2/3 of my work is about performance management and urban school systems, and 1/3 of my work is about HR and urban school systems. So at any given time, I have about 12 districts or so that I'm doing performance management work with. So it's been a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be here in Anchorage with the team and to do some work. So we have about 20 minutes. I'm going to suggest that if you have clarifying questions or I mumble, that you interrupt me and immediately, but if not, hold your questions till we're done, because some of the questions may be answered as we go through the deck. So hard copies of the deck over there. I think deck is probably available, so we can take care of that. So, okay. So just quickly, these are the things that are on the scope. And they were mostly related to tracking how complaints come into the system, are kind of digested in the system, processed out of the system, and the degree of satisfaction that people have with those processes. So that would be the summary of the scope. To do that, we did a whole bunch of work. I keep saying we because Dr. Dana Kodak joined me for most of this, almost all the online work she did. She's a former big, large urban district person, so she's very good at rummaging around in policy work and finding stuff. So I was here for 2.5 days on site, I think the 3rd week of April, if I recall, did interviews and focus groups with folks, talked to the operations side, supervisors and managers, talked to principals, collected all kinds of artifacts. I've seen every kind of report that's generated inside the district. I've seen every kind of tracking system that's been used inside the district or not used. More about that in just a moment. Reviewed all the information that's available about the regs and statutes here in Alaska, and then of course the overlying federal stuff. And then in the last 2 weeks, I've done 18 kind of scrambling around, getting follow-up information and artifacts with folks. So we're ready to go. I think we're going to give you something that's useful today. So I want to set this up. This is an odd thing to do in such a process, but I want to contextualize this a little bit. Okay. We're talking primarily about the green bar here, which is the complaint bar. Okay, somebody has a complaint, they need to know who to complain to, it comes into the system and they work on it. Above that, there are crises that happen. There are 2 different kinds of crises. There's honest to God crises where God forbid somebody gets killed or hurt or something, it's a bus accident. And then there are social media crises. We'll talk about that too, all right? But both of those things kind of blow the complaint process out of the water in some ways. right? Below that, people have lots of concerns. They walk in and talk to principals dozens of times every day. They have lots of things that they want to talk about. That's fine. We're not talking about those either. I put culture on the bottom of this list for a very clear reason. It became very clear to me as I even started, and as the process went on, it got clearer, that there is a diminishing amount of goodwill in Anchorage generally for the school system. That's probably coming out of the pandemic, right? It may be coming out a little bit of all the wonderful change management things you have going on. We'll talk about that too. But my point is, it's going to be hard to get a grasp on being sure that people feel heard and safe to be heard unless you also address the cultural parts of it. Does that make sense? So the cultural parts of it are pretty simple. If you can continue to work on goodwill, and you'll never have 100% goodwill, but if you make that a priority, then a few things will happen. Fewer complaints will come in. That's the first thing, right? Second thing is that people will trust the process, that you won't be hearing this, I didn't like the outcome, I don't want to talk to them, it's going to be retribution. And then lastly, you'll have people in the community who have your back, right? That when somebody says on Facebook, this happened, that someone else is equally likely on Facebook to say, yeah, that hasn't been my experience. All right. And right now you don't have too much of that. So we'll talk more about this as we go along. But I just wanted to set that foundation of, to have an awesome culture, you have a whole lot of things that like start to weed out as you go further up the system. Make sense? Okay. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk mostly about transparency, accountability, and goodwill. Goodwill is what I was just talking about. Accountability is the degree to which people are held accountable for their behavior and for remedying situations. And transparency is that everybody in this room know what's going on. All right. And the short answer to that question at the moment is no. So we'll come back to that too. So these are the way the slides are organized. I did a run through with this with Marty, and I had them, as you would normally have them, findings first and recommendations later. That became a little hard in the constrained time that I have. So we're going to do blue slides of findings, green slides of recommendations, and we're going to crack through these headings just like this. I want to highlight the fact that the meat of it is primarily in district and school level resolution. Underneath that are the mechanics of it. So what does ticketing and tracking look like? Who has roles and responsibilities? There's a reset that needs to be done. And then lastly, the kind of abstract pieces are the organizational learning and the cultural pieces, goodwill. Top line findings of these. The number of complaints is actually quite low. When you look, it's actually quite low around the system. For example, special ed, there were 16 complaints last year that came in through the Alaska State Department of Education. Given that you've got 6,500 identified SPED kids, that 16 complaints is not a big number. Okay, that's one example. So the intake and response processes that you have are working. There are a bunch of them: public information requests, citizen complaints. Some of them have to be written, some of them don't. You have EDO things, ADA claims. Everybody can find a way to do this. Okay, they can all find a way to get in. The people who take those complaints in know what to do with them. All right, there's pretty good triage that happens with Katie and Dr. Brian in the board chair's office. So, you know, pretty clear about that people can find their way in. I will say that if you go to the webpage, one of the things I heard was people cannot find a way to complain. And at the beginning, that's what I heard. When you go to the district's webpage, no matter what webpage you're on, there is a place that says contact us. And when you click on the contact us link, it opens a complaint form. And so you type in your name, you type in your email, and that goes to the right person depending on which page you are on. So, and that works, so it works on your phone too, which is one of the things that sometimes happens, doesn't work on your phone. So that's a good example of intake is perfectly fine, by and large, it's finding its way through the system. One of the biggest problems that the board, I imagine, has is that right now there is no way to track and ticket complaints. We'll come back to that at some length, but it's important to know what's coming in, what's the pacing of those things, what's the resolution of those things. Right now, there's very few systems around that, with the exception of citizen complaints and public information requests. The roles and responsibilities for complaint investigation and resolution are unclear. That is not related to the people. It's related to the fact that as the changes have been made in the equity office and you've moved some people around organizationally, it just isn't clear to other stakeholders like who's doing what, right? So for example, student Title IX things go to the equity office of Tony, staff Title IX things go over the employee relations folks. Obviously, sometimes there's a Title IX student staff overlap, so who owns that, you know, that kind of thing. So that's what I mean by roles and responsibilities are unclear. This next one is very common in every place that I work, which is, first off, in the best of times, you have to continue to reset practice. You have new principals, you have new managers, you constantly have to update training, you constantly have to reset people. And coming out of the pandemic, that didn't get done here. So you have really everything you need. You have handbooks, you have procedures, you have everything you need. You're not missing very much at all. But you have to reset it, all right? And be sure that everybody has it. And then lastly, you would benefit from trying to increase the goodwill across the system, for the system. All right, so district level resolution, I'm gonna try to avoid being repetitive here. But as a general rule, not as a general rule, as an absolute value, let me say that. When you ask people about complaints, one of the things that everyone will tell you is that complaints are expected to be resolved at the lowest level of the system. So that means that if a person comes in and complains about something to a principal, then it's involving a teacher, the principal will almost 100% certainty say, have you talked to a teacher? All right, and as that goes up through the system, that's what happens. There's a lot of really good things that happen when that happens. Some of the bad things that happen when that happens is you don't always catch everything, right? Because things go quickly down to the bottom, they don't necessarily surface back up. You have two experienced people who are doing EEO and ADA complaints over in the Employee Relations Office and some boom shop. They're experienced, they know what they're doing, they work perfectly fine. The Equity Office is also doing investigations of student Title IX stuff and a bunch of other equity stuff. They have an investigator over there. So your staff, you have what you need, okay? Student complaints, as I said, often have an adult overlap, so that handoff between those two things often gets in the way. Citizen complaints, things that come in from the city ombudsman, and just public information requests are the rare things that are actually tracked. And they are tracked at beginning and middle and end because Dr. Bryant and Katie keep track of that kind of stuff, and they follow up when things don't get taken care of. Again, the numbers of those are generally low, okay? So I want to just stop for a second and say something about resolution. One of the things about working in the public sector and having a complaint process is there's almost endless ways to keep appealing things. Okay, so you don't like something, you go to the State Department, you go to Human Rights Commission, you go to court, you get a lawyer, you can do all those kinds of things. Inside the system, you don't like a suspension, you can complain to one of the senior directors, you get a hearing. Okay, there are almost no appeals of anything here. Okay, and so that would suggest to me that the investigation and the findings satisfy me. Which is not to say that they're 100% thrilled with the outcome or whatever. But if you were unsatisfied with a suspension, you'd appeal it. If you were unsatisfied with the appeal, you'd go to the next level. That's what you do. And there's almost none of that here. Pretty much the first cycle takes care of that. Positive, right? That's a good thing. So at the district issue,
How do you come up with that finding,
how do I come up with the finding that, because I asked.
that resolution? Who did you ask? That resolution?
Who did I ask? I asked the state and I asked people who hear appeals and around the office. How many appeals they hear. That make sense? Okay. So this is a recommendation set. So this is investigate and identify addresses and the way the workflow is done. This again is mostly between the employee relations folks and the equity office, but there are other little places where just be sure that like reports have a common format, that the level of grant size is the same. That, you know, that there's more commonality to it than not. Again, this in some ways is a reset thing. And then to clarify the level of authority of the equity office. So I personally like Tony. I think people respect Tony's work generally. I think that Tony has found her way as a new person in here, finding her way around. There have been some changes in personnel in that office. People sometimes describe her as an advocate. Other people describe her as an investigator. Other people describe her as, you know, like an appeal, right? So I think just better defining what that office is doing. I would propose to you that they're better if they're seen as, she's better and her investigator is seen as better, as equal to the folks at Andrew Sumblum's office, if that evens things out, okay? School level issue resolution, all right? Again, we're talking about lowest possible level of the system. There are variances, even though you have a common student handbook, there are variances in discipline code and consequences, investigation practices, and all that across the system. You might expect that with 143 schools, but it's always good to have it be as common as it can be. I would say that the definition part is probably clearer than the consequence part. And at one point you had some kind of consequence table that was used, and that's kind of gone by the wayside a little bit. So again, as we're talking about reset, that's a good reset thing to think about, is to just get that stuff standardized. Now, one thing that's very clear is that when school level investigations are happening, that the principals, even the new principals, seem to be very good note takers. So the key to all this stuff is to take good notes, right? And so that if it becomes a bigger thing, then you have good notes, you have documentation, who you talk to, when you talk to them, what you heard from them. And by and large, note taking, which is not the same as investigation, is pretty good at the school level. Roles and responsibilities between the principals and supervisors are a little bit unclear. I want to be very clear about this. That's mostly that when things get elevated, I would say elevated down here, let's say that. So a social media thing that needs to be cleared up quickly, for example, okay? That a principal may be in the middle of doing an interview or something and cleaning that up, and a director might come and say, we need to shut that down, or we need to get on top of that, or we need to, it's just kind of like different energy levels, right? So I think, again, however you resolve that, it should be clear when a director goes down and kind of corrects a principal. It should be clear when principals have authority to clean up their own stuff, you know? It should be clear, like, I talked to the senior directors yesterday in a different meeting, and I said, you know, I don't have any problem with you bigfooting in on something, but I think you should announce that you're bigfooting in on something. You're saying, this is important to me, and I'm coming in and I'm gonna take it over, rather than just like all of a sudden the principal wonders like, what's happening? Right, why is this happening? Is that clear? Yeah. So the connection between complaint investigation and employee formal discipline is unclear. So you have a formal discipline process, progressive discipline, you have a whole series of memos and things that happen, okay? And based on the reports that I saw and the follow-ups that I saw, I cannot make a connection between what those corrective actions are and formal discipline that's meant about, okay? Some of that is that this is weakening generally over time because of the workforce concerns. And the one thing I want to say is that the Stop platform seems to be working great, okay? Principals have learned that as they coach kids so the kids don't fool around with it, that Stop It works great. And principals actually themselves talk about it working great, which is good because they get most of the referrals. Again, standardize your handbook content here so that on both sides it's all fixed. Clarify the roles and responsibilities of principals about communication and stuff with their directors. This is all stuff I said when I did findings. Ticketing and tracking. This is a big problem and it's an easy one to fix, okay? Right now, you're not ticketing and tracking by ticketing and tracking by and large. Most large districts of this size use like Zendesk or something as an actual ticketing platform, okay? You don't have that. You use Jira, which is, I understand, is a project management platform. It's in wide use across the system, but not everywhere. So the idea here is that when complaints come in, that they would be ticketed and you could follow their process through the system to the degree that this branching, like it goes over from, you know, senior director to HR and then back to finance or some question or whatever, that you could track all of that in the system. It could generate reports so you could see how many things you have come in and all that. When you don't have that function, you're missing three big opportunities. You can't figure out how efficacious the procedural system is because you can't see it. You can't see the timing. You can't see who's touching it. Outcomes out of the system, so the findings, corrective actions are not reportable in any way. You could go upstairs and pull, downstairs actually pull files, you know, and take a look at them, but that's the words. You miss opportunities, therefore, to pick up on things that you could just jump on. So the two that I'm going to give you are, some people think bullying is getting worse. Some people think bullying is not getting worse. There's probably data that would tell you that, but we don't have the data. Right. Another one is that some of the things, particularly in population subgroups, pop up only in a situation. So let's say a Tony, for example, meets with Latin families for whatever reason, and only after she's met with the Latin families about a particular situation does she realize that some important document didn't get translated into Spanish, right? And so the district couldn't pick that up because they only heard about it in another situation, right? So Jira is available. We've talked about it. Mike and I have talked about it. Your guy, is it the other Mike that does Jira? Okay. So part of that is to encourage stakeholders, and this is a conversation I had with some of the senior directors yesterday, is that what is the frontier between concern and complaint? I think if you're a parent or a teacher, you come in and you say something and then you're more or less satisfied with that exchange, it's still a concern. If you come back a second time and you don't yet have resolution to it, if we can train principals and maybe even teachers, but certainly other managers around the system, to say, let's fill out a complaint form on that, then you've started to put that in the ticketing system. Like I said, you've got contact us forms on the webpage, you've got technology you can use for that. So once it's in the system, you can better track it. Okay. Roles and responsibilities, I'm not gonna belabor this, I've already talked about it. It's mostly a matter of deciding what level of accountability you want your investigators to have, who's gonna monitor that work, who's gonna look at the reports, whether you're gonna standardize the workflow, all the stuff I've talked about before. Oh, one thing I didn't talk about before is part of the reset has to be do with better training. So the annual required training, some of the other trainings for new folks and all that. The employee relations folks would say that it's being done, and I have absolute confidence that they feel like it's being done. But when I say, did you get your annual sexual harassment training this year? The answer is, yeah, I don't remember if I did it or not, right? And so that should be logged someplace, who got it, when they got it, whether they passed it. Yeah,
It's locked.
okay. But, yeah, well, but there's a lot.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's not just
Yeah.
sexual harassment, but there's a lot. So just to be sure the training is being tracked, so you know, that reduces your liability, of course, right? Again, I'm not gonna repeat this. The one thing I would say here is the third one, which is that to the degree that it's not a formal corrective action or formal discipline, and it's being handed off to someone to deal with, right now, because you're not ticketing, you don't have any evidence that that's being done, okay? So I'm gonna totally make this up because I know that I trust Sven and Sven trusts me. You know, that if Tony says to Sven, here are 3 things that have to be done about bullying with principals, and Sven says, this is awesome, thank you for that, I'm gonna get on it, blah, blah, blah. I have no doubt that Sven gets on it. But Sven doesn't write down that he gets on it, and so it's really hard a year later when Tony says, I gave Sven recommendations, and Sven says, I did them. You know what I mean? It's just very difficult to figure out, you know, whether they really got done or not. So just, again, it's part of tracking. Reset is super important. Reset is a matter of getting all the stuff lined up again, taking care of the frame, getting the principals in particular all in some kind of training. Okay, getting them reset around things so they're all doing things in a common way. And then, and I love principals, they're my very favorite people in the whole world. But if you don't supervise them around that stuff, they won't necessarily do it, right? So when you reset them, to be sure you're checking the work as they go. There are procedures and artifacts that remain available to you. I made a comment about we need an administrative manual or something yesterday. Misty went down, came back with the 2009 Carol Commode administrative manual. That's like this. We had documents in there from 2001. Nothing wrong with the 2001 document, except that it was printed on mimeal paper, I swear to you. And so probably we could at least freshen up by photocopying it, you know, that kind of thing. So this I'm recommending later on, you'll see, I'm recommending that you put a little workbook together that likes directors and principals and stuff and just decide what the body of work is that you're going to do. Okay, and then you can reset it. But one of the reasons it hasn't been reset is actually very healthy, which is that principals have a lot going on. And so it's very difficult to say to principals, we're going to require you to come for 2 days to sit and get a bunch of stuff that's going to reset you. That's painful for people, but you got to do it because otherwise they're not all upset about it. Okay, some of that you can offload in terms of tech and asynchronous stuff, but some of it they have to sit and they have to hear it. Okay, you have a lovely IRL and real life boot camp that you do right now for mostly off-site people. Every once in a while, school site people attend it. It would be wonderful if you could just like combine those two things in some way so that school site people get the common stuff that both the off-site people may need at the same time. It would probably build relationships between.
When you say on-site,
Off-site, I'm sorry, with a P, the operations side people. So your bus, your school nutrition, transportation, all those people. Yeah, yeah, thank you for that. And then just be sure that you book Dr. Brown who's completed training. So org learning, we talked about that if you have ticketing and tracking, you can actually step back and look at what's happening. You can learn lessons about it. You can change your policies. You can address trends, that kind of thing. Organizational learning, set aside time at the board meeting, at cabinet, at senior leadership team to look at stuff. If you're ticketing and tracking, then you can look at dashboards. You can figure out what's going on. You can have key people come in and report. You have a very good structure for that right now in terms of review of materials. So a parallel structure to that would help you like have a little cross-functional group that could, quarterly prepare a report that people could look at and say, oh, it looks like we're having a bullying trend coming in, or we're having problems reaching this particular family audience, so. Goodwill, I've said a lot about this. Panorama survey is not useful, period. It's, Chris Opitz is trying to make it more useful, which is great. The participation rates are low, so we want to build on that. Marty Lang is thinking about doing a pulse survey, which is also a very useful way of thinking about people's satisfaction with the system. HR already is doing stay surveys and exit surveys of teachers. Again, the participation rate is low. You have a lot of really good change management stuff going on. Some of it people love, some of it, is going to rub people the wrong way. And so you have to be able to, use change management practices to get some of the complaint levels, some of the frustration level down, so that they're not on Facebook complaining about something. It's a change management problem. Okay. And I know that demographic subpopulations are often a challenge here. It's a very, very diverse community, very diverse school system. But there is a sense that some of those groups are underutilized in terms of their voice, maybe unrecognized in terms of their voice, and others get more attention. So I just think being systemic about that might help. I live in California, so I'm not too far away from home, but I started my week this week in Atlanta, in a school district in the metro. Superintendent gave his opening year thing. New superintendent. First thing he said was, my biggest accomplishment of the year was I have 5 advisory groups that I meet with every single month. And he named them all, special education, this particular population, whatever. Every superintendent has their own style. I assume that Dr. Bryan is doing similar kinds of things. But basically, the more that the community knows that they have alternative ways of getting in front of you, the more that it reduces the complaint. And I think that's my thing. So scale JIRA to ticket and do that, get a cross-functional team to get the reset organized, create an ongoing structure for looking at the information that you're gathering, and then work on some goodwill, and you should be fine. Now I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's incredible. Questions from the board, committee?
Made reference to site surveys that are being done. What type of site surveys did you see that will be
I didn't
conducted?
create any such surveys.
Oh, HR was conducting. that.
HR is conducting exit stay surveys. My understanding is that the exit surveys are going for people who are exiting, and stay surveys is a retention strategy that Marty Lang can talk about.
Okay. Did you do anything at all looking at the issue of a chilling effect? Did you consider that, where people are afraid of raising concerns because of potential retaliation? Did you do any review or assessment of that issue? Because that impacts the number of concerns being raised.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
Did you look at any specific concerns that were big attachment issues that may not be part of it?
Can you say that again?
Okay. Did you look at any specific concerns or allegations that were raised that were kind of high profile that may not have been going to the state?
I didn't look at specific things. I looked at trends. So I looked at bullying, I looked at social media, I looked at how those were being handled. I looked at the specific ones related to, like, in those buckets of things, how things were being handled, what the corrective actions were, what the investigations looked like, who had been interviewed as part of those processes. Social media, I looked at basically how the social media flow is when people get agitated about things that come up, in social media inside the system. We want to do that, but I didn't reinvestigate anything that had already been investigated.
Okay, yeah, some reported, but maybe not investigated. I don't know. It's all kind of issues out there. Those are kind of things. That's all I really had to do.
Yeah, so let me just say something about social media. My personal belief about this would be that social media is not a complaint. Okay, it's probably something for you to deal with if there's something on Facebook or something you don't like it, but it's not a complaint until they complain. Right? So you may have a PR problem and you may want to deal with a PR problem, but that's not a complaint until somebody who complained about something then comes into the system and says, I want to talk about this specific thing. Then you have something you can investigate. But before that, it's a goodwill problem. It's a political problem. It's not a complaint, right? Especially when they go to your webpage and click contact us to fill out a form.
Just to drill down on something Member Higgins mentioned, I understand you specifically weren't in conducting your own investigation to assess if there was any chilling effect or fear of retribution or retaliation when reporting, but did that come up tangentially in any of your interviews at all?
No.
Okay, fair enough. Other questions by Member Holland?
I do want to say that the ticketing idea seems marvelous. I guess there's no way to do it retroactively, is it? No, just kidding. But I can see where that would give us data and give the administration a lot of direction to what could help highlight areas, problem areas, and document things as they went along. Because I'm thinking of the few times that, like, the board hears appeals, the history of it often is as unclear as everything else. And I can see where, especially in a district of this size, which we tend to think of this as a very small town, but it's not, that would be a huge plus in the long run.
If I agree, President Holman, I'll also add that aside from suspension data, it's really hard to track bullying if it doesn't end in a suspension and track trends there. So the other thing I'll note, because I do it for a living myself, is tracking data takes people hours, and we've cut administration year over year over year over year over year over year over year, at least. So if Dr. Bryant, please loop in the board if you need additional staffing support and you choose to move forward with the tracking. I anticipate that that's going to be significant additional work to do so. With that said, we're going to have an opportunity for additional comments. Maybe we'll make our last one before we move on.
You mentioned lots of inputs from people at the Ed Center and stuff, but I didn't hear, how did you get input from like teachers or TAs or like
That was very deliberately not within scope. It was principals, managers on the operational side, and then, just looking at what they've been investigating in terms of getting a sense of what's happening out in the field. Teachers, parents, that kind of stuff. So I looked at, for example, the corpus, the body of the ADA complaints and where that's coming from. Those are all field-based things, but I didn't talk to any of those.
Member Higgins.
I'm curious, if you ever worked with a situation where they had a chilling effect, and what type of recommendations you may have generated to try to address the lack of confidence in raising concerns of how to reverse that problem?
Well, I'll say two things at opposite ends of the continuum about that. So the first thing I would say about that is there are always people who say, I fear retribution, I'm worried about what will happen, that kind of thing. The only way systemically to deal with that, district-wide to deal with that, is to increase the level of goodwill so that people say, it's safe, I'll go with you, I'll represent you, I'll talk to you, you can do me this here, you can do that, that kind of thing. At a school level site, the thing to do sometimes is that's a leadership problem, management problem. And there is some history in Anchorage of doing events where people go in and do listening tours at schools, feel what the concerns are among the staff, among the parents, that kind of thing, and then come up with a corrective action plan for that principal, or they move that principal. There are incidences here where that has happened. So I think there's two versions of the chilling effect. There's kind of this the general, I don't feel safe, and that's a very difficult thing to deal with other than through improving goodwill. And then there are principals and leaders and different managers who just get in trouble with things. And the district's response to that historically has been to do listening tours and go in and get a better sense of whether that's a real corrective problem in that situation.
This is a great conversation. Again, it sounds like we're going to have an additional opportunity to do more of a deep dive. But we do have other items on our agenda. Thank you so much for the presentation. I don't think we get to cover so much in so little time. We'll move on to B3, an update to Board Policy 5131.43, harassment, intimidation, and bullying. Ms. Grant, are you pulling that up? Thank you so much. I'll start by indicating that I, based on community feedback and, we have a comment online. Okay, great. So based on community feedback and it seems to dovetail actually with kind of some of the information we just heard, I have submitted for the committee's consideration and potentially the board's consideration if we choose to approve this, an update to this board policy in particular, which would ask that administration once per semester notify students, parents, guardians, staff members of the options available for reporting concerns of harassment, intimidation, and bullying, to include the new option, Stop It, to report, which has the option to report anonymously. It sounds like that, at least through the leadership level, there isn't a gap in knowledge as to how to report. with that said, I think it's always great to have additional awareness when possible. There was also a change made by administration, which is noted in blue on the second page regarding some definitions. Dr. Brian, did you want to address that?
Yeah, so we have been looking at our bullying policy. We came into the work session a couple weeks ago. And I actually have the team here. Sarah has been doing a lot of work. We were doing this, and then we saw your proposal, and we thought we really wanted to have bullying, harassment, and intimidation defined in board policy. It would help us at the district level and at the school level to be able to have that. We're doing a lot of work, and if Sarah, you want to talk about what else we're doing in regards to this work, but we wanted to, since we were doing a look at this policy, we thought we'd want to get this into that as well at this point. Sarah, you want to kind of explain why we wanted to pull all three out, what we're doing?
Sure. One of the things we noted, and that was in the presentation, is the lack of consistency. The lack of consistency of definitions of behavior, and they're being defined differently at different sites and then being reported differently. So we want to really work on clarifying the definitions and having examples of exactly what this behavior looks like at elementary and middle and high school, so that there's kind of a way for people to calibrate. Oh, okay, at South they're calling it this, and at Bartlett they're calling it this, and I can have that be the same reporting. So as some of that work, as we were diving in this year and looking at, we realized we don't have clear definition of bullying, harassment, and intimidation. They're all lumped together, and so we know that there has been there was a decrease before COVID, and then it's starting to have an increase, but we don't know exactly which one it is. So we've been doing a lot of work kind of looking nationally at how people are defining this, and really pull together what we think are three clear definitions. One of the other things that we recognize we need to do is sometimes bullying is used as a blanket term when it really is just conflict, pure conflict, or kind of mean behaviors or inappropriate behaviors. And so how do we help our school and our community really understand when it truly is bullying and when it is just conflicts between students that's not okay, that we need to address, but isn't really bullying. So that.
And then when we're reporting also, intimidation was one that we needed to have as an individual term, not necessarily lumped into with harassment.
Just one quick question, and then I'll just 30 seconds of closing comments from me before we turn over to the committee for discussion. Has administration had any bandwidth to think about how it would envision implementing a twice per school year notification to parents and staff about this? Would it like registration, an email? What would that look like?
I think it would be probably an email newsletter type of thing. We work with communications department. I don't envision that being a huge lift.
Right.
I envision that just becoming part of our yearly processes.
Okay.
We also yesterday found some really good examples of websites that had great information about these different levels of conflict and how to report it. And we have very little information on our website. So I think that's something we can really work on, is having just a public page that everyone can go to. It's clear for everyone what this is and how to report it.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Yeah, I think my vision for this was touched on in the presentation. My experience when our community knows they have an opportunity to relay concerns, which whether they use it or not, that generates goodwill, which I think clearly it seems like we need to ensure that we're prioritizing when possible. And so I think this work policy tweak could potentially do that. It's also something I think that should just happen anyway. I think it's a good best practice. So that's my proposal and why I submitted this relatively minor tweak. Is there discussion from the committee or board at this point? Member Higgins, see a furrowed brow.
My only comment is that sometimes one of the complaints from parents is they get a stack of all this stuff from the school district and they don't read it all. And it's hard to go through it. And if there's some way to, one, recognize maybe the reading level for most of our parents of sixth grade level, and that there's some way to make it so that it's less here's the whole policy, here's this, here's that, but making it so it's something easy for them, for all parents to be able to go through it, see it, and catch it. That's one of the big complaints I remember from the Minority Education Concerns Advisory Committee, is that the type of information again is too much, too college level, and hard for them. They're not going to sit down there and read 20 pages.
Almost everything that we do now, as far as we put out, especially to parents, we have kind of this group of people. We have our Tony Riley working on it. We have our Title I director working on it. We have our Migrant Ed director working on it. Our Indian Ed director working on it. We actually look at how does this go out now? Because we did hear that complaint, especially around other things that we did last school year, of a lot of surveys. So now we're really being intentional as we put stuff out, and I could see this being one of those things. We also have a thing, the ASD Digital is going out now, and that reaches a lot more people, and they don't have to go check an email.
Well, I dated myself by telling you it's an old complaint, because I refer to it as a minority education, it's multicultural. So that tells you how it's been a while since that complaint I've heard. I haven't heard it recently, but it was a concern.
With that said, I think Member Higgins touched on something which could be valuable in that. Ensuring that if it's something that's on our website, it can be translated, because we have a Google feature. Our comms teams have been doing amazing work with YouTube videos. I could see there being a general awareness opportunity there, and then there are some folks who still would prefer paper. If there's an opportunity to implement the ways to report at registration where folks are still going physically in a building, maybe that's something too. But that's the how is really my goal is to defer this to administration, and so it's worded in that way. With that said, are there any other questions or comments before I ask the committee to consider moving to the full board at the next opportunity for discussion?
Limiting to that, or get to this definition.
It would be both. So these changes in blue and in red and green would be, yeah. So Member Higgins.
I look at the bullying definition, and that bothers me. It's confusing to me a little bit, because when you get to the unwanted negative interactions, I understand, but unless there's a perceived imbalance, it's not bullying. So if you got two kids that are one's pushing another one all kind of ways, and they were similar size, then it's not bullying. I don't see how that's not bullying. I can also see a student provokes another into a verbal or physical confrontation. There you could have a physical imbalance, but that's not bullying if it leads to a confrontation. But if it isn't, then I just don't see that's very unclear to me, that when someone is deliberately unwanted negative interactions by a student, the fact that they're similar size or similar age doesn't, to me, make it any less bullying.
The research around bullying nationally, really, it does have that power imbalance in there. And I think that's where that's peer conflict. It's ongoing peer conflict. And when you don't have that power imbalance, it really isn't categorized as bullying from kind of some of the national bullying research out there. It's still not okay. We want to work on conflict resolution. We have to address it. That has to be reported. But it really has to, the bullying research out there says it has to have that power imbalance to be considered bullying.
How are they going to react differently if it's bullying versus doing the same thing and you're not defining it as bullying? I mean, it's being defined as just bad interactions, and it's not going to be treated the same? Because to me, that's unclear here that is acceptable.
I think one thing is that there's a victim when there's bullying, right? There's one who's being targeted continually and they're being the victim. When you have a peer conflict, two kids kind of ongoing, sometimes one's the victim, sometimes the other. It's that kind of back and forth, and they both are needing that resolution skills. But when there's a victim, they're the ones who need some advocacy because they don't have the ability to get out of that ongoing.
So if they have the physical capability of fighting back, it's not bullying. But if they don't, so it has to be the imbalance before it's considered to be bullying.
I just, for our record, Member Higgins, that's one of those perceived, which is important. I have two youth in my home, for instance, who similar size, similar age. One happens to be an introvert, one happens to be an extrovert, and the extrovert happens to engage in bullying behavior and takes the silence as someone being submissive. And so I think we're, thinking David versus Goliath, or, a 16-year-old versus a 10-year-old, and perceived power imbalance can take an infinite number of forms. And so I think that using that language, the definition is particularly broad. With that said, you touched on, the concept of work needing to be done regarding consistent discipline, which I think was highlighted in the audit we looked at. I think that's a separate conversation that also needs to happen. This is just an attempt to update this version of the policy.
We have a lot more going on with that.
Sure, yep, and I figured as much.
We're working on the overall, every type of behavioral incidents, coding and what they actually be. That's gonna come later in NAR.
So the other definition of harassment would cover what you're describing that is not bullying, could probably still constitute harassment. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it could, if it's that disturbing or threatening to another student. Yeah, and you can see the examples there, kind of stalking, hazing, social exclusion. There's other, we have a whole list of other behaviors that it might also be categorized as well. And that's the other work we're doing in addition to that, is clearly defining those and having examples so that principals can look and say, I see that is really this, and having it be categorized the same way. So,
one example I could give is when an issue comes up and the student says, I'm being bullied, but a month before, this student was bullying that student, and the month before that, it was the other direction. And is this really bullying? It's probably more of a conflict between these two, right? And we go quick because there isn't a definition about what is bullying, what is harassment, what is conflict, and that's why we have that confusion there out there, and that's kind of what we're trying to
I recall about 10 years ago where they had a student at South who came back with a Colaban type threat email. You probably remember that one. And that was a pretty big deal. And with the meetings with teachers, with parents and with students there, some of the students asked the question, what are you going to do about the kids that have been harassing this kid? And when are you going to start doing something? So it was kind of linked it back to a Colaban threat to directly lack of action. And these were peers, okay? So it wasn't this imbalance with the bullying, but they called it bullying. And so that's the only reason why I want to make sure that when the intent is to make someone uncomfortable, to make them feel threatened or something else, whether we call it bullying or harassment, that we treat it the same and we have the same obligation to deal with it.
The other thing is bullying can be by a group of people, right?
mm-hmm.
That there's an imbalance there when there's 2 or 3 people against one. That's an imbalance also. It doesn't necessarily have to be one person and one person. It could be a group of people bullying a kid. I mean, we have that often, and you're dealing with that as a whole different issue. I mean, as a bullying issue. So that imbalance can be in a number of different forms.
I got the perception from students it was other individuals, not as a group, but other individuals all harassing this person or bullying. And they used the word bullying. I think harassment would have been more accurate.
Okay, I think it was a great conversation. Are there any other comments or feedback before we ask the committee to give a recommendation?
So just one quick comment. As we were looking at the national trends too, cyberbullying does tend to be a much broader, where they are nationally putting all of these things under cyberbullying. So that's why we did our recommendation was just to leave that, because that is kind of a separate thing. Whereas most bullying has some electronic component in it anyway. Kids are generally not just stealing lunch money, they're using social media.
So, yeah, I noted that the definition seemed to be more up to date. So I tracked that. Okay. Hearing then no other comments or feedback, our committee members are Member Wilson and Member Higgins. I'm going to ask that the committee move this forward, and that would be my vote or recommendation. Member Higgins, do you have a thumbs up or thumbs down as to moving this forward for the full board?
Thumbs up.
Okay. And Member Wilson, any objection to moving this forward to the full board for consideration at the next opportunity? Did say Member Wilson, right?
Yes,
Okay.
she's unmuted, but.
So sorry. This is Dora. I agree as well. I was having trouble with my phone.
No worries. Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you to administration for collaborating. I appreciate the committee taking time to hear, and the staff support to make the briefing today possible. Appreciate what you do. We will move on to our next item, B4 procurement audit scope. We have an attachment in front of us. Dr. Bryant, would you like to present?
Sure, so similarly to how, or not similarly, but we're starting to begin the process of getting the board involved in developing scopes for board requested audits. So this is our opportunity to collect some input on a proposed scope that Andy has put together. So Andy, I'll hand it to you.
All right, thank you. So really for the proposed scope that we've put together, I really want to ensure that the board is on board with this because we want you to get the information out of it that to make you feel comfortable with our purchasing department. So really what they would do, what we would have someone do is look at the 3300 series of board policy, which defines what our limits are for purchasing scopes, you know, what basically all our purchasing policies within the board. Recommend any best our practices or changes we can make to update the limits or whatever it is based on public entities for our size, particularly in education. And then verify consistency and alignment with those practices with board policy. That's where you're pulling audit samples and saying, did this transaction, what did it follow board policy? So that's typical in any audit. And then the other thing we've heard is concerns about which categories are exempted from the competitive procurement policy. So have them review that for best practice as well and see if they have any recommendations for changes on that. But really want to get any other scope of services in there so you guys are comfortable with this audit going forward. If we're going to spend money on it, let's get something that you guys are going to find very valuable.
Thank you, Mr. Ratliff. Dr. Bryant, questions, comments, feedback on the proposed scope? Member Higgins.
Thank you. And D is specifically what I think we're referring to there are those that are considered to be exempt because of an emergency acquisition, whether that's being properly handled, because that was one of the issues that came up, or whether it's being exempt because it's a professional service. So those are two. And I don't know if that's really exempt from policy. It's covered by policy. The policy says to do it this way. But I feel like both of those need to be looked at. I'm going to make a request to the administration for the last 5 years of when we've used that, because it shouldn't be that extensive. But I'm going to be interested in seeing that. But those are two that stand out. I think this is the scope, but the process is the other issue. Is will the board members have a chance to meet with the auditors and explain specific examples or issues to make sure that they're not excluded, because that represents applications that we have specific ones that we think ought to be looked at. That's what wasn't, they didn't have the opportunity for the last audit, and this audit, I don't want that to happen again, is that, you know, and you probably go with E, you know, identify or respond to specific concerns that the board may have in regards to past applications of policies.
So let me ask a clarifying question. So Member Higgins, are you requesting a reinvestigation of past incidents, or do you mean in general reviewing the previous process and correcting a process?
Specific instances where they may have violated or may be different than that. We've had an emergency purchase. That was one that you're familiar with. I know we've had issues raised that purchasing of some items should be exempt as professional services when I think it's a product. So there are specific ones that I would like to make sure that they can look at that, because to me, an audit is not looking at just what is your process, it's looking at what you've done, whether you're meeting those requirements. And if we have specific concerns what may not have been met, then giving a chance for the board governance committee and board members to provide feedback and say, hey, this is a specific concern. We're having a third party look at it objectively without the board members being engaged. And the results can come back without identifying specific details. But I think it's very important that we clear up the air if there's questions or issues.
And I just want to make that clear because depending on the vendor, some want to specifically focus on the processes. That's been my experience with the Council for Great City Schools. There may be other vendors that do more forensics and investigative situations on past issues. So I just want to make sure that we're aware of the differences, because that'll impact who we select as a vendor.
I've had success with the Council of Great City Schools that looked at specifics, whether it was the application of everyday math. I remember that one, or other specific ones. They came in and did a great review. I think the review of this particular issue of all these concerns, the first one we just finished, if the scope of that had been fully known, I think we would have had interest with the Council of Great City Schools, but we didn't. because it was much more extensive from my standpoint of what I thought we were going to get done. So I do see E as being, but not on there, but looking at or responding to specific concerns and looking at how that can be modified the scope.
Right, and so what you guys want to, I mean, obviously I'd like to have the council, whoever we select to do the audit, meet with you guys prior to conducting it, just so they can get that background of what you guys are interested in.
That I think, what I'm hearing from everybody is how that translates to something we can put in an intelligible sentence on a page would be perhaps a meeting with the board before the process begins to get a mind's eye from the board perspective as to why the audit would be valuable. Maybe the auditor can look at those specific incidents as an example and justification for why we're looking at the process.
Right, the auditors will put together a schedule of who they're meeting with and when, so we can just have them put that in there. I don't know that needs to be in a actual scope, but as long as the auditor or the auditors are aware that we want them to meet with you guys before conducting it, I think that's.
Yeah, I'm aware of, specific, which surprised me a little bit, conflicts there that might exist, but I have no idea how the policy would change to even address that. So I'm going to tell you, I don't have all the answers here. I mean, in some cases, I just have the questions.
All right, so Dr. Bryan, is it fair to say that administration has committed to allowing the board to have a meeting with the vendor before the audit begins to better understand the vision for the scope?
That's right. I think that's an important part of the process.
Okay.
And I don't know what you guys want to meet with them as a group, as the governance committee, or individually.
That's a great question, probably more appropriate for a conversation between myself and President Holloman. Could we get to that answer offline?
Of course.
All right. Great. Okay. So we'll get that answer. I think we've got commitment that the meeting will happen. Are there other comments or questions on the scope of this audit, President Holloman?
Something that's occurred to me somewhat recently is, should there be published information, either strictly to the board or to the general public, about purchasing processes in an ongoing way? Like, I can, and I'll apologize if this is available and I just don't know it, but if I could look at our open contracts or the purchasing processes that are underway that haven't resulted in an RFP, to be able to go back and look at contracts that are closed, completed, and just notes about overruns or underruns, modifications. I know as a board member, I can always request, but that takes time and always attracts attention, I think, to a certain degree. It just occurred to me that being able to look at that information from time to time could be real useful if it doesn't create an onerous burden. And if it's normal, then I really have no idea if it is or not. But if someone were to ask me how many significant contracts we have out for RFP right now, I couldn't answer. I couldn't tell you how many are going on right now. And things like that are relevant to just kind of tracking the activity in the district.
I'll mention that the community work agreement is dealing with the issue of the advertisements of contracts, because we've got union and non-union potential competitors that are impacted by the CWA, and the non-union group has talked about confusion. So we're looking at the contract is one thing, looking at the communications out there within the district as a whole. I don't think that's something that needs to be included in the audit. I just wanted to disclose that it's something that's ongoing at the same time.
All right, any other comments, questions or feedback before we close up this item and we assume that the scope is approved from this committee, which has jurisdiction according to board policy related to such audits? Hearing seeing none, we'll call this resolved. Dr. Bryan, have what you need from us?
We say,
Great, thank you both. We have one last agenda item. We are technically at time, but I wanted to, if with the committee's indulgence and administration's indulgence, take just a couple minutes and talk about a process for 6115 ceremonies and observances. We have Member Donnelly here, the sponsor of this board policy amendment, Member Bellamy, as the board member at a recent meeting, moved to send this item back to committee. Again, we are at time today and Member Bellamy is not here. My proposal is that we borrow a page from the legislature's book and have a quasi amendment deadline of our next governance meeting, which is in August. And Ms. Grant, I don't know that you have that date offhand, do you? It's the date, I think we've agreed to have the meeting, utilize the finance committee meeting schedule. Do you know when the finance committee meeting is in August?
You know, I do not. I'm
Okay.
sorry. America may have that information.
Fair enough. We don't have it offhand, but my proposal is that the governance committee have an amendment deadline and finalize our decision on 6115 at our August meeting. Member Donnelly, do you have any perspective on that?
You said 6.
That's the board policy.
Policy.
Yeah.
If we could just get things like 24 hours before the committee meeting, it'd be helpful.
This agenda was published multiple days ahead.
No, I mean the.
Oh, you're saying in August?
Because, yeah, people
Yes.
had suggestions if we had them 24
Sure.
hours in advance.
What didn't get said, but was in place for this meeting is that we had our agenda and attached documentation published on Monday or Tuesday. So that expectation will hold for the committee going forward.
Yeah, but I'm referring to proposed changes.
Agreed.
or- Yeah,
Those will all be attached to the agenda when it gets published.
thank you.
Which will have the same timeline as our board meetings. So it'll be publicly noticed 3 days ahead of time. Any objection to that timeline then? All right, I'm going to say no. With that said, that completes our agenda. Without objection, I'm going to ask that the governance committee adjourn at 12:02 p.m. Member Higgins, you have an objection?
Just one, yeah, I do. I just got one question. We raised the issue I did last time, and I don't know if we need to do a policy, but like the state was gonna have a tennis tournament in Yom Kippur, which is like, no Jewish kids are gonna show up for that because it would violate their religion not to be that total day of forgiveness and all that. So no eating, no drinking at the synagogue all day. But there are other days out there. Do we need something in the way of policy? I'd just like to look at, just want to share that so that if that's necessary or if we already have it in policy. We used to have it in policy, we added it, it was in there. And I just don't know if the new policy changes after I got off in 2017, if somehow when they did a new policy, they ignored it. So I'm just gonna let you know that's something I think should be included for the next meeting.
And so as a member of this committee, my suggestion, frankly, my request is that you consider drafting something and bringing it to our August meeting so we can incorporate it into this change if we'd like, or decide if we want to conduct a separate process. But that's exactly what this process is for, is we can utilize the next 2 months to come ready for our August meeting and get this resolved in one way or another. With that said, Ms. Grant.
Just really quick, I have the old policy manual and I'm happy to look for what we have.
Great. Okay. All right. Any other objections before we adjourn?
Doing it.
Hearing, seeing none, we are adjourned at 12:04 p.m. Thank you, everyone. And we are off.